So, we just got back from quite a wonderful trip to Asia. In many, many ways, going to Singapore and Malaysia, Indonesia and India, and doing various different Dharma activities there. In the Southeast Asia, I was giving Dharma talks, and then in India, I was receiving teachings. So it was, kind of giving and receiving, taking and giving, but in another kind of way. And one thing that I was thinking about throughout the trip, because I come from a humanitarian, humanities background in terms of my education. So looking at things through history or sociology or so on like that. And it really struck me how the development of Buddhism and existence of Buddhism in each country is so influenced by the politics in that place, the economic situation, the culture, that there's so many different things going on. Especially thinking in Southeast Asia, because there I was mainly with the Chinese communities. And although Chinese started coming to Southeast Asia and Indonesia way back in the 16th century, the big influx of people whose descendants I'm, speaking to, started coming the end of the 19th century and then all through the 20th century. Some people coming just to leave the economic difficulties in China, some coming actually during the war to get away from the communists. So, coming to that part of the world. And yet how the Chinese community practiced Buddhism in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia is all very different according to the, the country that they're in. So there was that, seeing that, and how, the policies of the government, for example, in Indonesia, after the independence, after the Second World War, the government tried to get all these, they have over 300 different ethnic groups in Indonesia, to get them all to speak the common language of Bahasa Indonesian. So the Chinese couldn't have Chinese signs on Chinese shops in Chinese language. There was no more Chinese education in the public school, and so on. And so many of those people now don't speak Chinese. And so that means also they don't have contact with the rich Chinese literature, Buddhist literature. Yeah. Whereas in Singapore, many people were Chinese educated until recently. When did they start all becoming English ed? I don't know, a few decades ago. Yeah, maybe the 70s. Yeah, and so there, Buddhism in Chinese is still very prominent in Singapore. In Malaysia, you have a lot of Buddhism in Chinese, yeah, but you also have a lot of Theravada Buddhism for two reasons. One is that they border on Thailand, and so there's a lot of influence from Thais coming in and practicing Theravada, especially in the north part. But then also, until a few decades ago, until more recently, people were English educated. And so the people who are now middle-aged, they met the Dharma through speaking English, not through speaking Chinese, even though they are Chinese. And because Buddhism in English was predominantly Theravada, for example, because monks from Sri Lanka came to Malaysia, then that English-speaking, that group of Chinese are mostly Theravada. But now more people are Chinese ed, and so they're going to the Chinese temples. So according to how the government changes language policies in a country, it influences what form of Buddhism people practice and how they practice. That's quite interesting. And then you think about India, and you have the whole Tibetan refugee community, but then you have all the untouchables, too, who converted with Dr. Ambedkar in 1956. And now, and most of those, were untouchables or Dalits, but now the Dalits are, a lot of them are converting to Pentecostal Christianity, because again, it isn't involved with the caste system. So it's so interesting, isn't it, how, Buddhism in practice and takes form according to all these other non-Buddhist kind of conditioning factors. And here in America, not having any texts in our own tradition really influences how we practice, because the whole Kangyur and all the, the Buddhist word and all the Indian commentaries, we have little bits and pieces translated, but nothing in our own language, like it is, let's say, in Pali or Chinese. But then again, in Theravada countries, although the Sangha chants in Pali and the lay people chant in Pali, it's not a living language that people speak. So I wonder how much the lay people understand what they're chanting. Yeah, it's quite interesting, these different factors. And then here in the U.S., psychology is so big, and so Buddhism is being seen through the window of psychology. And, how can Buddhism help people with psychological problems? Whereas in Southeast Asia, psychology is not a prominent discipline, and there's still somewhat a stigma about going to therapists and counselors. So people go to the Sangha for their problems. Here in America, people go to therapy for their problems. Then they go to Buddhism, and some of them think Buddhist teachers should act as therapists, but they aren't trained as therapists. They aren't therapists. Expecting, Buddhism to have the same role in your life as therapy doesn't work. Yeah. And so now certain Buddhist ideas are out in the therapeutic world. For example, mindfulness being used in psychotherapy and drug programs and pain reduction programs and all. And so Buddhism is influencing the popular culture that way. But then, when you have therapists teaching meditation or teaching mindfulness, what are people going to associate with Buddhism? And do they think that that's all Buddhism is mindfulness meditation? No? So it's quite interesting, this whole way that the Dharma relates to a culture. When Buddhism went into Tibet, the local spirits and the local deities were really big things in people's minds. And so you had Buddhist ceremonies being created to make offerings to these local deities and spirits and so on, because that was what the people wanted. Here you still, we're importing Tibetan Buddhism, but all those ceremonies for the deities and spirits don't have the same interest here, because that's not, in the most of the American belief system, but psychology is. Yeah? So I just find it quite interesting to look at things that way and see that, to me it really points out interdependence and dependent arising, and that Dharma is always existent in a culture, and that culture always influences how it looks and how it's practiced. So while the Dharma truths are unchanging, the packaging changes. We have to hope that the packaging doesn't change what the Dharma is, because sometimes, cultural views may not correspond with Dharma views, and some people may, as I say, throw the Buddha out with the bathwater and just say, well, we don't like this teaching, it doesn't fit with our culture, so let's leave it aside, or let's say the Buddha didn't teach it, and that's not right. Yeah. On the other hand, trying to make ourselves into people from another culture doesn't work either. Yeah. So, and I hear many people talking about American Buddhism, and even when we had lunch with, right before we left, with one Chinese abbot, and he was asking, what do you think American Buddhism is going to be like? And I had to say, I don't think there's going to be one single American Buddhism, because here we have all the different traditions coming in, plus the cultures where those traditions started, meeting American culture. Yeah. And so how things percolate is, it's going to change. It's going to be interesting how things come out. And even, how, what is Buddhism in the West going to look like when the traditions go to middle-class communities versus upper-class people versus lower-class people or impoverished people? How is Buddhism going to be practiced differently, even by different social classes in the country, because those people have different interests? Yeah. So you have some American Buddhists, they have special committees for, reaching out to people of different races in America, so that their communities are not all white upper class people or white upper middle class people. At the Abbey, we don't have that problem. We're not, most people who come here aren't upper middle class people. Maybe the majority are white, but we get people from all races and all kind of ethnic groups here, which is quite interesting, considering that we live in a very white part of the country, white conservative part of the country. We wind up having people here from all over the world in many different languages and so on. And we don't even do anything special. We don't have a committee to create diversity. We just are diverse. So, there's all these factors that influence how you practice and what you practice, and maybe even why you practice. Many people in the West are attracted to Buddhism because they think it goes with their liberal political views. But then you have to check, because some aspects of Buddhism don't go with the liberal political agenda. Yeah? And then, should Buddhism in the West be limited to people who have certain politics, simply by who it attracts? Or, is that happening naturally? Or maybe, we have to have a special group to show that we don't side with just one political agenda. Yeah? It's quite interesting to think about these things. Of course, on an individual level, it all comes down to us practicing, and really doing our practice and transforming our minds. But in terms of dealing with other people and spreading the Dharma, I think it's helpful to have some view of, some understanding of how different societies work, how different people in different cultures think, what their issues are, and so on.